St. Petersburg, February 1917. In the middle of a bread riot, the Tsar's soldiers received the order to fire on the protesters. But instead of pulling their triggers, they lowered their rifles and side with the crowd. Tsar Nicholas II had ruled as the absolute head of the Romanov dynasty for over 2 decades. His family held total control over the empire's wealth, living in a state of gilded isolation while the country's social foundations began to rot. Outside the palace, the empire was a landscape of extreme poverty. Millions of landless peasants were forced to work soil they could never hope to own, trapped in a cycle of debt and subsistence. In the cities, the newly formed industrial class faced equally brutal conditions. Laborers were pushed through 16-hour factory shifts with no legal protections, creating a volatile, exhausted workforce. Russia was already at its limit. Then the state entered World War I, a conflict it was fundamentally unequipped to sustain. The Russian military was so poorly supplied that millions of men were sent to the front lines without basic gear. Some regiments were forced to wait for their comrades to die just so they could pick up a working rifle. While the military bled out, the home front disintegrated. Rail lines were diverted to the war effort, cutting off the cities from the grain supply and turning the simple act of buying bread into a daily battle for survival. The St. Petersburg Mutiny was the logical conclusion of this systemic breakdown. When a government can no longer protect its borders or feed its capital, its authority ceases to exist. The revolution began with a series of grassroots strikes led by women. They marched into the streets demanding one thing: bread for their children. Their desperation was infectious. Within 48 hours, hundreds of thousands of industrial workers walked off their jobs to join the mothers in the city square. Without a loyal military to clear the streets, the Tsar's ability to govern vanished. Power shifted from the palace to the crowds in a matter of days. Nicholas II abdicated shortly after, ending 3 centuries of Romanov rule. The empire collapsed almost overnight, leaving a provisional government to pick up the pieces. But destroying a monarchy is easier than building a new state. The vacuum left behind by the Tsar created an opening for someone with a much more radical vision. Vladimir Lenin had spent years in exile, waiting for this moment. Seeing an opportunity to knock Russia out of the war, the German government helped him return home in a secretive, high-stakes move to finish the destabilization of the country. Lenin won over the masses by distilling their grievances into 3 specific promises: peace, land, and bread. It was a tactical masterpiece that addressed every failure of the previous regime simultaneously. By October, the rhetoric turned into a physical offensive. Lenin and his Bolshevik faction were no longer interested in shared governance. They wanted total control. Unlike the chaotic protests of February, this was a surgical strike. The Bolsheviks methodically seized the railways, telegraph offices, and bridges, capturing the city's infrastructure piece by piece. Under the cover of night, Revolutionary Guards moved on the Winter Palace. They arrested the members of the provisional government, ending Russia's brief experiment with democracy. By sunrise, the Bolsheviks were in charge. For the first time in history, a state was being rebuilt on the principles of communism. Lenin had proved that a highly organized, ruthless minority could successfully seize a country of millions, provided they were the only ones with a clear plan for the chaos. The October victory didn't bring peace. Instead, it ignited a civil war between Lenin's Red Army and a coalition of enemies known as the Whites. The human cost was staggering. The war, compounded by disease and famine, left millions dead. The very people the revolution promised to save were often the ones caught in the crossfire of its consolidation. The Bolsheviks eventually emerged victorious, formally establishing the Soviet Union as a centralized, one-party state. This victory created a permanent ideological outpost that challenged the global order. It sought to export its revolution, eventually splitting the world into 2 hostile camps. This fundamental split between communism and capitalism hardened into the permanent alliances of the Cold War, dictating global stability for nearly half a century. The Russian Revolution remains one of history's greatest paradoxes. It proved that a movement born from a desperate cry for bread can ultimately build a global superpower, but it can also build a system that values the ideology of the state over the lives